Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on this special Friday edition of Roster Mania, we are going to discuss a ton of moves that happened today, and that were reported by own bomb dropper CRONE. We have something to talk about for pretty much every team in the league. But before we do that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. Yankees got a big walk-off win against the always lethal Orioles just a couple minutes before this. So
Hard-fought victory there.
now, now we got some Call of Duty to talk about, so we can hop right into it.
We do. We have a ton of moves. We're just gonna list off some things that happened over the past few days, and we have some coaching news as well. So, accuracy was officially released by the Minnesota Rocker. John, TJ, and Venom were released a little bit earlier in the day, a few days ago, by the Los Angeles Thieves, and then a few hours later, Slasher was announced as also being released by the Thieves. I wrote both of those articles, so that's kind of why it popped in my head immediately. And then the news today, at least in terms of coaching, is Atura. He is out as the Florida head coach. He spent the last 2 seasons with the Mutineers. And Paris Legion, we were just talking about him in the pre-show. They have decided to retain Coach Theory and keep him on for the 2022. That's a lot of twos. They keep him on for next season. Um, where do you want to start here? Just give your thoughts on some of the stuff that we weren't able to talk about on the last episode because it happened, obviously on the Wednesday that everything
Yep.
apparently drops on. So just give me your thoughts on what happened over the past few days and today.
Yeah, so first off, starts right away. We said it on our last episode of Ego Chall that something was bound to happen immediately after we recorded the last episode on Tuesday, and sure enough, we got those announcements of accuracy and the LAT guys being released on Wednesday. So it just seems like tradition at this point. But for the moves that Preston just listed off, the big takeaways, those are confirmed moves. We're obviously going to get into some of the reports for these moves that CRONE wrote about today. Those are unconfirmed moves from the organizations, but obviously reported via CRONE sources. So just the big difference here is that these moves Preston just mentioned, official. Accuracy is no longer with Minnesota. Those 4 guys no longer with LA Thieves. And then the ones today in particular, we can talk a little bit more about with Florida moving on from Atura as their head coach. I thought that was a little surprising because I've heard good things about him as a coach. And Paris is deciding to retain Theory. He obviously people know, are longtime fans of Call of Duty know Theory. Most notably was a part of the TK roster at the beginning of World War II that went back to back at the start of the year. Always known as being a smart OBJ-oriented player, and he made his coaching debut for Paris last year. Obviously, Paris didn't have the best season, but they're deciding to stick with him as the coach, and they obviously, we talked about in the last episode, they wiped their entire team, so Theory will be coaching 4 new players most likely this year.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough job for him no matter what because this is something we talked about on previous episodes, but Paris is in probably the hardest spot in the league in terms of the caliber of player that they can go after or that they will go after. So he has a tough road ahead of him, but I mean he's had a tough road already for Paris, so I think it's not anything new for him. And like you, I was pretty surprised about Atura being released by Florida. Not that it, as in terms of results, Florida was inconsistent this season, and they didn't, they finished tied for 8th in the CDL championship, so it wasn't a good end to the season as well, but just kind of surprising because I figured that they would give him another year, and I never know how much coaches are really affecting the performance of a team, so I couldn't really tell you if Atura was helping or hurting them, to be honest. And the same goes for Theory. That for COD coaches, it's like kind of up in the air and ambiguous, in my opinion. But those are the things that happen today, the coaching stuff, and then with the accuracy, John, TJ Venom, and Slasher releases, it appears that the Rocker and Thieves are moving on from them. I mean, we talked about it on the last episode about Slasher in particular. Where would he fit into this Thieves roster if Octane, who we thought was the kind of the leader in the clubhouse, so to speak, as the replacement? Where would he go? What would if he would kind of depart from the Thieves? But it does appear that he is out with Thieves, and so are John, TJ, and Venom. Let's get on to these CRONE bombs. He was dropping them really, really quickly today. There were a lot to talk about. Let's start with London. So this is something we've also talked about on previous episodes about what kind of player London would go after, because they seem kind of determined to make themselves that premier, English team or a premier UK team. And CRONE reported today, .esports.com, you can get all of the esports information, and CRONE reported it on .esports. So he reported that Zero, Nasty, and Gizmo are at the top of the Royal Ravens wish list. So Zero and Nasty both were contracted to London previously. Zero was supposed to be a starter on the 2021 London roster, but because of visa issues, he was not able to enter America, so he wasn't able to join the team. So he didn't actually even play at all this season in the CDL. And Nasty was on the team's roster in the 2020 season, and I don't know if he had a similar visa situation, but he did not play at all for the Royal Ravens in the 2020 season. So they're kind of making their returns, but returns are in quotation marks. And then Gizmo would be joining the roster as well, and they would presumably be joining Afro in the starting lineup. He's the only London player that the Royal Ravens decide to retain going into the next season. So, do you have any thoughts on this report from CRONE?
Yeah, so we talked about it on the last episode. Like you just mentioned at the end there, London did last week release all of their players except Afro. I believe in the player tracker, for the official CDL player tracker they were mentioning, I believe it said they extended his contract, which obviously makes sense. Afro was a bright spot for London at the end of the season, so it makes sense that they would want to build around him. The player I'm in particularly excited about here, if this roster comes to fruition, is Nasty. I know I talked about it in particular on the last episode of the podcast, but I probably said it a couple times by now that I just want to see what this kid has. I've heard really good things about him, and even in the NW season when they originally contracted him, I was getting excited to see what he was capable of. Obviously, it never happened, and I don't really watch a lot of European challengers, so I haven't seen him too much in action. But like I said, I've heard good things about him. So if this roster does happen, I'm excited to see what he's able to do in the pro league. I believe he's a sub player, so him and Afro would presumably be the sub duo, and then Zero and Gizmo would be the ARs, or like Zero, one of them would be in a flex role, depending on the roles there. Again, I don't really know much about Gizmo either. So yeah, that's if this happens, I'd be excited to see Nasty. I'd be happy for Zero too. Obviously, like you said, with the circumstances, he basically didn't get to play at all this year. I think he played a little bit in challengers. I'm not really sure, but I know he was supposed to be a CDL starter at the start of this year, didn't get the chance to play because of visa issues and COVID, all that stuff. So this would be good for. I'd be happy for him if he got back in the league, and this would be a chance for him. He a similar wow, really messed up there. A similar trend we're gonna see with a lot of these reports that CRONE put out today is that it looks like teams are building around like one veteran and then three young guys. At least a couple of these teams that CRONE reported on. That seems to be the formula that teams are trying out this year. So Yeah, that's my initial thoughts on this potential London roster.
Nasty and Gizmo, they played together in Challengers this year. They actually won the European Challengers finals.
Yep.
I mean, there's obviously a lot of talent there. And then, like to confirm, Zero did play a few months of Challengers, but I think he was kind of holding off in the beginning because he was kind of hoping that things would work out for him. Things did not, but it seems that London is gonna put him back in and make things work. When he was able to play, especially in IW and even in like World War II, he was a really, really talented player. I remember in IW that he was being considered to be like one of the better players in the world. So the talent is obviously there. And then you got the young players, Afro. We didn't get to see too much of him in the last season, but he did look to be pretty talented as well. So, good luck to London. I think that's a good roster, and that seems to achieve their goal of building a UK roster and kind of
Yep.
keeping their base in England. As for Seattle, another CRONE bomb, Accuracy, who we just talked about a little bit earlier. He was officially released from the Minnesota Rocker. CRONE reports that Accuracy is expected to lead the Seattle Surge's new roster, which will also include Sib, who was a FaZe substitute this season, and he was on FaZe Academy last year as well. And Accuracy and Sib would be joined by Mac and Pred. Mac, obviously, New York Subliners player. He kind of came out of nowhere last year, and I don't believe he had any like professional LAN experience until this season, like late in the season. Um, he was kind of an unknown, and then Pred, who is an up and coming Challengers player as well. What do you think of this roster? We talked about Seattle trying to what could they do because they've had a lot of bad press from former players and Nubsy. So, what do you think of Accuracy, Sib, Mac, and Pred?
Yeah, this is an interesting roster. Similar to what I was just talking about with the London roster, it seems like if this reported roster comes to fruition, it would be along the lines of the same formula where you have the veteran AR player and you surround him with three talented youngsters. Um, in particular, with this roster, if it actually happens, I would be excited to see Pred and Sib in action, just because I know Sib has been hyped up in North America Challengers for a bit now, and Pred has seen a lot of success in the APAC region. So we obviously saw some of those APAC players play in the first season of the CDL on Paris, but we didn't have any APAC players in the Pro League this year. So it would be good for that region. I know CRONE tweeted out in particular about this one that he would be happy if Pred is actually on Seattle. So that would be cool. The only thing with this roster that comes to mind right away is the need for a second submachine gun. Um, I I feel like both Sib and Mac are more flex players. What I've heard about Sib is that he literally will use whatever gun he feels like using at that particular time in the map, which I mean could throw things off, or it could work out for him in some situations. I don't really know. That's just word on the street that I've heard. They were talking about on the flank earlier. And then Mac, we've seen him run both the sub and AR. So that would be my question. Just who you presume Accuracy is your main AR. You got Pred on the sub, and then who's going to be that flex and who's going to be the second sub. It seems like it would be Mac on the sub and then Sib on the flex. But again, that's just, this is a reported roster for a game that we don't even know what the meta is going to be like yet. So that's a problem for a later time. It seems like for a team like Seattle that hasn't had the best two first years in the CDL, they're answering, a lot of questions or claims about not getting young talent, I guess you could say. If this roster comes to fruition, they're putting that stigma to bed and actually giving some young guys a shot. So will be interesting to see how this roster does if it becomes finalized.
To give some background on who Pred is, because if you're a fan of the CDL, then you may have never heard of him because, I mean, not a lot of Australian teams, go to international events when there were international events for challengers. So I mean, he's kind of been sequestered off into the APAC region all by himself, and with renegades and everything. So he's only actually played, according to COD Gamepedia, he's only played on 2 lands. Obviously there haven't been a lot of lands lately because of the pandemic and everything, but his last land was the launch weekend open for challengers, so that was January 2020. He played with Renegades. They finished top 6, which to me sounds pretty good considering, I mean, they're, you know, probably one of the only APAC teams there, and every challengers team was probably trying to go to that event. So that's pretty impressive. And then, I mean, the online challengers results are pretty just wild. I mean, they've been basically farming prize pools for the APAC region. They won this past year's APAC finals and challengers, and they also won last year's challengers finals and APAC. So, and then they won a bunch of other challengers cups and challengers opens throughout the season. So, I'm glad that someone in APAC is getting a chance. It used to be the Mind Freak guys and the Tainted Mind guys. Those were the players that everyone was like, I hope a team will actually give them a chance and let them kind of prove themselves. And Pred appears to be maybe the only APAC player in the next season to get that opportunity, but if he succeeds, I think we could see more players from the region pop up in North America. We've seen, that the reciprocity roster from a few seasons ago. They performed pretty well, and we'll see. I guess that does it for Seattle. Let's move on to,
Just
or what'd you say?
just to add on real quick,
Yeah.
I can't remember if we talked about it on the last episode or not, but I know CRONE tweeted about it before this report. But additionally, part of this report is that Sam Phoenix is reportedly going to be Seattle's head coach for this reported roster, and he's known for coaching that Singularity team that Insight and Kleenex were on during the Black Ops 4 Champs run, where those guys basically started making a name for themselves really. And he coached like some of the Western and Eastern guys this year in NA Challengers. So that's another, we'll be seeing, we will potentially be seeing a coach making his debut next year in the CDL alongside uh, potentially seeing Sib and Pred make their highly anticipated debuts.
It should be interesting. Um, they they should try to build their roster around the younger challengers players, because if they're not able to spend the money to get a big name player, then that's really your only option. And I felt the same way about Paris. And any team that isn't willing to, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to, sign a player, then your options are just sign really washed players for the minimum, or try to sign a unknown player to at least the general public, or a top challengers player who's willing to sign for the minimum and hopefully get something out of it. I don't like. There's really no other options out there. So hopefully Seattle was able to not finish last next season. That would be a benefit.
They didn't finish last this last season
They
because
finished
of that run.
second
They
to
finished
last.
ninth.
Oh yeah, yep. So, yeah, get to the top 8, and then we'll be in business. Let's move over to the Los Angeles Guerrillas. Another ChromeBob.esports.com. Crone reported that the LA Guerrillas are looking to build around Slasher, who was recently released by the Los Angeles Thieves. And then Slasher would be joined potentially by Gunless, Hook, and Asim. So Gunless was released from Seattle during Champs. Hook has not been released, but he is currently under contract with the Los Angeles Thieves, presumably after being traded by the Dallas Empire midseason. And then Asim is also presumably under contract with the New York Subliners. He signed in the offseason. He previously played for the Minnesota Rocket as well. This would be a pretty interesting lineup. This is kind of, the gunless slasher reminds me of Rise Nation, but obviously Slasher and Hook also played together partially this season on the Thieves. I can't think of a time that Asim and Slasher would have played together, but interesting nonetheless. What do you think about this reported LAG roster?
I really like this roster on paper. Um, I don't think it was too hard to put the dots together, but I know we were talking about in the last episode on potential like landing spots for Slasher if he left LA Thieves. And I just said that LAG made sense to me because, Slasher is a Cali kid, so I'm not saying I predicted this or anything, but it's just I don't think it was that hard to see this being a possibility. And if this roster does come to fruition, I'll be super excited to see how they perform because I think it's a really strong roster on paper. Uh, from a roles perspective, they basically have everything covered, whether it's like a 3 sub meta, Pierce can run that third sub for them, or if it's a 2 AR, 2 sub meta, Slasher and Gunless will both be on the ARs with Hook and Asim on the subs. I think this roster has a lot of potential to, be the best LAG team that we've seen yet. Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, Slasher and Gunless have that history with Rise. Slasher also has that history with Hook on Team Envy. So they have prior playing experience together, and then if this roster actually comes through, I would be really happy that Asim is still in the league and didn't lose his spot. We've talked about it multiple times throughout this entire podcast. Just everything that Asim has gone through and the New York Thieves went through in the 2021 season. I would be happy for Asim that he gets to keep a spot and continue to show that he's a good player and deserves the opportunity to play in the pro league.
This roster is not set in stone, as none of the rosters that we've talked
None,
about,
yeah,
other than like the ones we said that were confirmed. But I just found it interesting. So this is the last paragraph in CRONE's article
yep.
regarding the LAG. Vivid was another name the Guerrillas approached, according to sources, but it's unclear how far those discussions went. I am like, what? Like, so LAG, who very controversially benched Vivid during this season. Vivid played for the Guerrillas in the 2020 season. He was the only player from the Guerrillas to come back for the 2021 season, and then he was benched pretty early on in the season by the Guerrillas. And he was benched for Cheen. I mean, we love Money Cheen, but it was a very controversial benching. And then he was eventually moved to the Dallas Empire, where he finished third at the CDL Championship, while the Guerrillas did not even qualify for the CDL Championship. So I was just kind of flabbergasted by the whole thing about. I understand maybe there isn't the bad blood and maybe it's more of like, if we can actually put a good roster around you, would you be willing to come back? Maybe he will. We don't really know. It's not a certainty that Asim, Gunless, Slasher, or Hook will end up on the Guerrillas. But it does appear that that could be the roster, which I agree with you. That's a very talented roster. It'll be interesting to see. I think Gunless is really the biggest like question mark, because there's just been a lot of questions around like whether he is the same player he used to be. Like, he used to be like the most dynamic flex player in the league or in the world, and was able to basically do whatever he wanted on the map. I don't know if that's more just like the rosters he's been with for the past 2 seasons. He was with the Huntsmen last year, and then this year with Seattle. Like they didn't play well at all until the till land came. So I don't really know how much stock to put into Vivid's or not Vivid, Gunless's performance over the last 2 seasons, but really interesting roster nonetheless.
No, I mean, there's just a ton of talent. That's the best way to put it. But there are questions, like you said, with Gunless. I think he played well, especially as you noted on land. To end the season, he was kind of getting back to that big P form that a lot of longtime Call of Duty fans know him for. Um, and then the other obvious question mark is Hook. Like we outside of the game stuff aside, like he was benched by the Thieves at the end of the season. We didn't get to see him play at Champ, so there's going to be some questions around him if he's able to come back. He was, as we've talked about, he was one of the MVP candidates for Stage 1 this season. Then after that, just kind of went downhill for him. So, and even Slasher, he was benched mid-season this year. Now, if this roster comes to fruition, he would be on the other LA franchise playing, as a rival against the team that benched him in the previous season. That's an interesting storyline. A lot of storylines with this potential roster. Like we said, a lot of talent on paper. It would just come down to executing in game if it happens, and I would definitely be looking forward to this one.
One of the players that I thought may be a possibility for the Guerrillas was Crimsix, but CRONE has reported that he has been linked to another team. CRONE reported today, .esports.com, that Crimsix is eyeing a reunion with Clayster in New York, and that also on the Subliners radar is Neptune, the rookie from Florida. This would be a very interesting roster. Obviously, two of the three-time world champions teaming up again. They were split up forcibly by the switch from 5v5 to 4v4. I don't think Dallas had any plans on changing that roster had 5v5 stayed for Cold War. But the fit kind of seems odd for New York in this case if Crimsix does end up teaming with Clayster. What do you think of this move? Do you think that in a 4v4 COD, Crimsix and Clay could mesh like they did in 5v5?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're two of the best players in Call of Duty history, just straight up, no other way to put it. But that would be my question with this roster is, we don't know the meta for Vanguard at all yet. So it's very possible it's a 2 AR game, and then, there's not a lot of questions if this roster happens. But in a world where Vanguard is a 3-sub game and this roster happens for New York, which of Clayster or Crimsix would run that third sub for New York? That would be the main question for me. Obviously, I don't know how much weight you can, like I said, since we don't know the meta, I don't know how much weight you can put into that with roster construction. But that's just like one immediate thing that jumps out to me with this reported roster. There would be a lot of talent, obviously. If they do get Neptune from Florida, that sub duo of Hydra and Neptune would be really gross. It would, just two young guns running around, and you got Clay and Crim behind them holding down, intended lines of sight and locking stuff down. So, I think it has potential to be a good roster, but it's going to depend on the meta if this happens. What kind of happens there if there's ever a time where they need a third sub. But that will definitely be something we're going to have to keep our eyes on. The other thing with some of these other players, obviously there are buyouts involved, but for this New York team in particular, both Crim and Neptune would have to be bought out of their current teams in order for New York to land them. So that's just something to keep in mind with this one.
The benefit for New York though is that if Mac and ASIM both go to Seattle and Guerrillas respectively, then they'll be able to sell their contracts and then kind of use that whatever money they're getting for Mac and Asim to get Crimsix and Neptune. I don't really know what the price tags are for these players, but I would have to imagine that Crimsix, his contract is much higher than any of the other three players that have been kind of mentioned as like either outgoing or incoming from New York. But regardless, the most important part of the offseason in my mind for New York was retaining Clayster and Hydra. That was like Clayster is the leader, he is the face of the franchise, and Hydra is potentially he could be one of the best players in the league if things go right for him because he showed a lot of promise this past season. With him in the lineup, New York was one of, if not the best hard point team in the game at a certain point in the season, and then things fell off during the near the end of the season. But I think overall, the 2021 season could probably be considered a success from New York as they were able to get Hydra into the United States and allow him to kind of progress as a player in the CDL. And I mean, if you're able to keep Clayster around, that's a huge win for the subliners. And adding Crimsix just kind of helps, like whatever veteran leadership Neptune and Hydra may need. Then you have it with Clayster and Crimsix, two of the best players of all time.
Yep. And I mean, from like a fandom perspective too, obviously Clay has a pretty big fan base, and Krim might not be like the most popular player in terms of like since leaving Optic, and a lot of guys like to hate him and stuff. So from a storyline perspective, it sets stuff up for New York too. Obviously, Krim's gonna want revenge on Dallas for presumably or basically being released. And then he'll still always have that rivalry with uh whatever Optic team we get. So like if we have their proposed Dallas and Optic combo, that's kind of just like adding more fuel to the potential rivalry matchup of Crim versus Dallas/Optic. So a lot of interesting tidbits here with this potential roster.
One last thing on the subliners before we go on to the next topic. Uh, CRONE included this in his article. He said the New York Subliners also released head coach Revin last month and will be looking to replace him in the upcoming weeks. So CRONE seems to indicate that Revin is not just kind of posturing for a new contract, trying to like hold out for more money. It does seem like uh, the subliners may actually be moving on from Revin and going in a different direction for their coach. I would assume that JP is going to stick around. He seems like a very useful addition to their analytics staff. So not sure what direction New York would go for a coach, but as long as say Clayster and Crimsix are there, I think a veteran coach would be probably suitable. I don't think putting a 20, 21-year-old with Clayster and Crim and then having them kind of I mean they're very vocal leaders, so they need that Rambo kind of presence of like the veteran that they either played with or against that they can respect when they voice their opinion.
I mean, if he wasn't killing it in Warzone, I was actually thinking like the perfect fit for a coach for this team would be TP, just because like you said, he's played with both Krem and Clay in the past, obviously on that uh, iconic Dynasty Cole team there. So I think like that was the first name even before you brought up the notion of a potential coach there. Like TP just like jumped off to me, and I don't think it's gonna happen. I think he's doing okay for himself, just streaming and doing content creation. But it will be interesting to see who fills in that New York slot if Revin doesn't return. Another possibility would be Looney too. Obviously, Looney announced that he's interested in coaching. He hasn't coached before. I'm not sure if he ever played with Clay or Krim. There might have been
Maybe
some
Indy.
time like early when Looney like first came up. They might have like cross paths or something. But regardless, it's that type of player you're thinking of for a coach for this team if Revan doesn't return, in my opinion at least.
Yeah, I'm trying to look it up. I mean, COD Gamepedia isn't saying that he teamed with either one of them, so
Yeah, I
um,
can't think of a time they would have.
but even then, maybe it's just the respect level of competing against a guy for years and years, and if they fit your strategic mindset, then maybe it works out for him. Don't know if it'll be Looney. Don't know who it would actually be because that would
Yep.
be interesting to see. Maybe I don't know. Maybe JP would just kind of step in and become a head coach. I mean, that's always an option. Let's move on to the Thieves, though. This was the move that we've been talking about without confirming it for multiple episodes. But CRONE reports that Octane is likely running it back with the LA Thieves, and that Envoy, who was recently released by Optic Chicago, he would be joining the roster. I believe I correctly predicted this on the last episode at the very end where we were talking about the
Yep.
top five free agents and where they might land. I thought that Octane and Envoy would fit nicely into the Thieves, whether it was with Hook or whether it was with Draza, and then obviously Kenny rounding out the roster. So, but Crone's actually reporting that Draza will be in the starting lineup, which lines up now that you have learned that Hook might be going to the Guerrillas. So, Octane, Envoy, Kenny, and Draza is the reported potential lineup for the Los Angeles Thieves going into the next season. What do you think, Bink?
This is another one I'm excited on paper, has a whole lot of talent. Um, you know, kind of like you mentioned, it seemed like Octane to LAT was essentially inevitable. Just, feels like Kenny really wanted to play with him, and Nate Shot's like, okay, we'll get it done. It is pretty cool too to see Envoy reportedly coming here, after being at Optic, uh, you know, going from Hex's team to Nade Shot's team. It seems like a good landing spot for him, especially with. It seemed like, as we've talked about, it felt like Optic was kind of like uh, trying to have Envoy set up to be Scump's successor if and when he retires. Obviously, plans change with that, and now Envoy's going over to LA Thieves. But he was in a lot of content with Optic, and he's going to one of these other organizations that puts a big priority into content. So I think it's a good fit for Envoy in that regard too. And I like the roles on this team. Um, kind of like we've talked about a couple times with the Thieves in the past. Now with this reported roster, you have Octane, that main AR, you have Envoy being your dirty work SMG, and then it just becomes a question of what Kenny and Draza both want to do, because they can both play either role as like a second AR or second sub. It's going to come down to one, what the meta is, as we keep mentioning here, and then two, it seems like for Kenny in particular, it comes down to like a feeling thing of like what gun he individually likes. So if we go into this game and Kenny likes the main sub, we could see Kenny and Envoy being the SMG duo for LA Thieves. Or, Kenny really likes the AR, and then Draws is running that second sub with Envoy. So they have some flexibility with that from a role standpoint with this reported roster. And there's just a whole lot of talent here, and it's another exciting one if it comes to fruition.
Yeah, the role flexibility is the biggest thing for this team because we've seen in the last 3 seasons that whatever team Kenny is on, that is like he can be a top level AR and he can also be a top level SMG player, but it's really about his preference because we saw it with him with Octane in Black Ops 4, where I believe he was, like he really didn't want to run a SOG, so he ended up being a Maddox player, and that kind of forced the Thieves' hand to bench Pharaoh and kind of make that kind of roster change because Kenny, it's been obvious, like that it was definitely obvious throughout this past season, but it was also obvious on the OGLA team that Kenny was the guy. Like, Mud Dog or JCap or whoever you want to say, or maybe even like if you go even further up, Nate Shot, like they are dead set on like Kenny being their centerpiece and building around him no matter what. And I mean, he's obviously one of the best players in the world, so that's a really good move. But you have to fit pieces perfectly around him to help him out because you need to make him happy in terms of his role because then he's able to do whatever he wants on the map. And bringing in a guy like Octane, who we've seen he is one of the greatest assault rifle players of all time in Call of Duty history, and he's still at top form. Draza, he's been really impressive over the last 2 seasons for the various rosters that OGLA and the LA Thieves put out there. And then, I mean, to have Envoy, who appeared, like you said, to be an optic lifer, to put it lightly, to say that he was going to be the future of optic, moving into like a post Scump era, whenever that would be. It's kind of shocking that a roster like this could come together. I'm sure it's a really expensive roster considering how talented all of these players are, but it looks like a really, really good roster on paper. It just kind of depends on how things work out in the real world.
Yep.
Let's move on to the teams that we have been reported to actually stick together. Toronto, who just finished second at the CDL Championship, losing to Atlanta FaZe in the grand finals. CRONE tweeted out today that they are expected to stick together, which doesn't really come as too much of a surprise. The Minnesota Rocker, who had that incredible comeback at the Stage 5 Major and had a solid run at the CDL Championship. CRONE also tweeted that they are expected to stick together with their roster. And then the Atlanta FaZe, the most dominant team all season long. They lost a handful of matches throughout the season, and then had their way with a lot of teams in the CDL Championship and won the world title. CRONE tweeted out, quote, "Atlanta FaZe are expected to keep winning." I think that's a good way of putting it. I was going to actually pull out my hair if they made any sort of roster change going into the next season, but it appears that they actually have brains and they are sticking with potentially one of the greatest rosters of all time if they can keep this kind of trajectory for a long period of time. It's ridiculous how much they can win. So Toronto, Minnesota, and Atlanta all expected to stick with their rosters that they finished the seasons with. Any surprises there or any comments regarding those three rosters?
Yeah, nothing in particular, not really surprised to see those teams stick together. So obviously, for whatever reason, if you don't know the rosters, FaZe would be expected to remain Simpa BZ, Celium, and Arcides. Minnesota would be expected to remain Attached, Standy, Priesta, and Major Maniac. And then Toronto is expected to remain Bance, Kleenex, Insight, and Cammy. There has been some rumors and discussion about Kleenex, which makes sense from a contract standpoint. As we mentioned earlier in the official CDL player tracker or whatever, he was the only player not extended. But he was also on that original, and Bance was too, but and Cammy for that matter. But regardless, Kleenex was on that original roster. So for whatever the contract situations are, we obviously don't know specifics, but it's safe to presume that there was some like 1+1 deal with Kleenex, and now he's attempting to renegotiate a deal with Toronto to stay. If CRONE is reporting he's expected to stay, but he might be like fielding some offers to try and get some more money or whatever. That's just speculation. But CRONE saying Toronto's expected to stay, so until we hear otherwise, that's the word on the street for now.
For the Mutineers, we talked about it with Neptune that he is expected to be bought out by the Subliners and join the New York roster. But CRONE tweeted today, unclear of what direction Mutineers are going for, with Neptune expected to be bought out by subliners. They extended all of their players, Skies, Awakening, Havoc, and Yeez, and are interested in signing Dave Patty, who plays main AR. They also parted ways with head coach Atura today. I guess what do you think about this? Because we talked a lot about Florida this season, about how they didn't really live up to whatever potential that they did show during the season. But what do you think about what Mutineers could be doing with Dave Patty?
Yeah, I mean, I would be, you know, I'm already slightly surprised with the Neptune move, just because, as we mentioned in the past episode, I felt like, he was a guy that Florida was going to try to keep, especially, he's got the Halo background. Ogre 2's Halo background seems to be a thing for Florida. Obviously they had Frosty in the past. So I was expecting Florida to try to keep Neptune around. But seems like they're going in a different direction. That different direction seems to be questionable, though, just at this time, just from a roles perspective, because we've already, had the discussion of like whether Florida wants to keep both Skies and Awakening, or only keep one because they're both, and they've seen the most success. Skies is really a main AR. Awakening has played a flex role, but it feels like he's seen the most success with an AR. And now if they're interested in bringing in Dave Patty too, he's another AR player. We really had, I mean, we were just talking about potential issues with Crim and Clay being on a 2 AR team. Like who knows what would happen with Florida if they had 3 ARs. That would, you would assume Awakening would have to move to a sub, and that still leaves you with 2 main ARs. So who really knows? I think we're going to have to wait to see what's going on with Florida there and hear more from them. But it is worth mentioning that Florida's put together, they didn't have a ton of success this year, but in the first year of the CDL, they made the right moves with their roster and won a couple of those online home series, saw some success there. So I think, Ogre 2 in the camp there at Florida knows what they're doing. So until I'm proven wrong, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I do have some questions about what's going on, and until we know what their, actual starting lineup is, I'm not sure how much there is to talk about.
Yeah, I just thought this was funny that Ogre 2's girlfriend or wife, I don't know which one, she tweeted, quote, just go pick up Reese Vivid, end quote, just that easy, smiley face. So I think she obviously is aware of the community saying, oh, like, why don't you just go pick up this, one of the fastest submachine gun players in the league and put him into this roster. I believe that was who I predicted Florida would pick up, or where Vivid would end up.
I think you did say that. Yeah.
I mean, from a fit perspective, it fits perfectly, because if you're replacing Havoc, or just trying to fit him into a roster, like if Florida's determined to keep Awakening and Skies, who we have seen are either flex or main ARs. Like they're neither of them are like the dedicated submachine gun player. So you can't that's why the Dave Patty stuff doesn't really seem to add up on paper, just because like how does it really fit? But I'm not going to question Ogre 2, because he has built some pretty good rosters over the past 2 seasons, and if they still are able to add Vivid, like just because they're adding Dave Patty reportedly, or they might be adding him, that doesn't mean that Vivid would necessarily be off the table. It would just kind of depend on who's kind of out of that roster. Is it Havoc? Is Yee's not going to play on the team, or is he still going to be a substitute? What's going to happen there? Just interested to see what happens with that team, because other than the reported Chicago, like whatever team would buy Chicago slot, like that's the most interesting in terms of like what we really don't know about how that roster will shake out. So pretty interested about Florida, and unless you have any other thoughts, we can move on to this Dallas optics, just kind of staying the same.
The only thing to keep in mind there with the Ogre 2's significant other comment is that Vivid is a restricted free agent, so they would have to buy him out from Dallas. But if they're presumably getting Neptune bought out from New York, there should be some uh, you know, exchanging of funds there. And obviously, we don't know what the buyouts for each of them are, but I'm not sure how different they would be. Um, I guess obviously that might be ignorant to say, but regardless, that is something you have to keep in mind that it's not as simple as Florida just saying, oh, if it's a free agent, we can offer him a contract. No, they'd have to actually buy him out, and that costs money. So that's probably part of the reason why we saw a sarcastic tweet like that.
Yep. And then CRONE was basically just keeping people updated. He said that the previously reported Dallas/Optic roster of Scump, Dashi, Shotzi, and Illy. So that would be a post-merger between Envy and Optic, or Envy's acquisition of the Optic brand from NRG, and then Optic would become the franchise in Dallas, reportedly. So Scump, Dashi, Shotzi, and Illy are still expected to be the roster of whatever the Dallas team is called for the 2022 season. And then CRONE also tweeted about Paris. So Paris is winning champs. Please listen up. The Legion have reached out to multiple challenger players from both EU and NA region. Unsure if they have an exact lineup ready to go, though. That's according to CRONE. So some pretty interesting things for there. And then finally we have Chicago. So I'll just read CRONE's tweet. Chicago's, in parentheses, NRG Esports roster is still completely wide open. Doubt we see any movement from that spot until it's sold. So, like I was just saying, that is the most interesting roster or potential roster because nobody is there right now. That the spot has not been sold officially, and it would appear as though nobody will be signed for the foreseeable future until that deal is closed, and whatever organization or individual that ends up buying that slot, then they would be making those moves. So really don't know what's going to happen with whoever buys that Chicago spot. So with the Dallas Optic merger, roster still staying the same. Paris reaching out to AMS in European challengers and North American challengers players, and then the Chicago spot just kind of being up in the air right now. You have any thoughts on those?
We can rapid fire through these, I think. Obviously, we touched on the Dallas Optic reported merger last episode. If you didn't check that out, obviously go ahead and check out our last episode. You can also check out CRONE and Jacob's Wolf report on the potential merger there on thoughtesports.com. Seems like there's nothing new really there. We still have that roster of Scump, Illy, Shotzi, and Dashi reportedly happening for the reported merger. So I think it's going to be some time before we have anything finalized with that, but that just seems like it's sticking with that direction for now. In terms of Paris, it's interesting to hear that they're reaching out to some of the AMs we talked about on the last episode. In both, mainly my opinion, but you kind of agreed with me that there is some potential for Paris to try to tap into that their French roots, potentially sign some French players from the EU amateur scene, and try and gain some fan base there through that. Obviously, we don't know with just the terminology of EU AMs if that's the route they're going down, but we can speculate on that, and it's interesting to see that they're going down the route of reaching out to AMs. It's again something like with Seattle that we were mentioning earlier. Fans have said, especially with that last roster Paris had, that some people wanted to see some more young talent getting an opportunity if Paris goes down this route of signing multiple amateurs. they would be in effect doing that. So it's good to see that out of them. Still, we'll have to wait to hear more exactly who they're contacting, what their potential roster is. But we do know, obviously, that Theory will be coaching whatever roster Paris decides to sign for Vanguard. And then, obviously, like you said, with the Chicago spot, again, it's important to remember with the reported merger that it's reportedly just the Optic brand being acquired by Dallas from NRG. So NRG would still own the Chicago spot in the CDL, and then reportedly they are selling to another party that's unknown at this time. And until somebody reportedly buys that spot, there's obviously not going to be any news on what the team is there. So gonna have to wait to hear more about that.
Yeah. I really don't have any thoughts on the Optic stuff or Dallas stuff, but with the Paris roster, Legion, if you're listening, and you should be because you stole my meme from earlier and you tweeted it out. So if you're listening / watching, then you should sign Money Chain to your roster because I'm tired of this bullcrap where I have to wait till mid-season to get my Money Chain fix. He better be in the starting roster for the Paris Legion day one. So Money Chain, Paris. Okay. And
That'd be an interesting collab for sure.
just like I thought it was just interesting that some of these top challengers players are not being linked to any rosters. Like you do have like Sib and Pred and everything, but like the team that won North American challengers, Mohawk, Prolute, Spart, and Saints. I haven't heard any of those four names come up. The team that finished second, Kismet, Godorex, Pander, and Pentagram. So you have former CDL players on that team. That's the so like that was built by Gamers rosters. So like I like Godorex at one point was like one of the best players in the league. So like I'm kind of shocked that he hasn't been brought up. There are just a lot of other players that you would kind of expect to just be mentioned at least, like Methods, who is, like we covered on the last episode, a restricted free agent, despite what he says and how he's considering himself an unrestricted free agent. Like, like he's able to be sold and like he's open to joining a new roster. Whether it actually happens is up to him. Maybe he will be a Paris guy. It just kind of depends. I think it'll mostly depend on the contract. Like, if Methods is getting paid more than the minimum, maybe Paris won't be too hot on him. But Royalty, Exotic, Fellow, and then the guys at LAG Academy, Exceed, Mox, Nero, Decimate, Slack, and then who knows about TJ, because TJ has been released by the Thieves. It's not looking too hot for him right now. I think my prediction is more likely to be right that he doesn't start in the CDL at the beginning of the season. At this point, thanks to CRONE, he's kind of backing me up here, but he is an option. I don't know if he's willing to do that or if he'd rather start like in challengers and just get a shot like later in the season. But I just thought it was interesting that a lot of these top challengers players haven't been mentioned, and other than a few.
And you got the Westar guys too, right? Like Zap was just on Paris, but you also got Paul X was released by London, Gravity. They certainly have options. It's just we're gonna have to wait to hear what comes of it. I was reminded though when you were just mentioning like the team that won NA Challengers was Saints. CRONE did report in May when he reported that Paris Legion was interested in getting Zaptius after failing to acquire Saints from New York Subliners Academy team. So Paris did have that interaction reportedly where they tried to acquire Saints at a time. So that could be a name on their radar. I don't really count him as an amateur, but I guess technically he is. Even he's been a vet and been competing for a long time. But that would certainly be an interesting name. But again, we're just gonna have to wait to hear more, see what Paris has up their sleeves.
One more name that I don't know how I forgot. Censor. Like, if nothing else, like I think he would definitely sign for the minimum because if he doesn't, he's an idiot. But like, if he, like, I think he 100% would sign for the minimum. And Paris, that's just good media. Like having him on your roster. I mean, even if you don't think you're gonna be like the most competitive team, you weren't the most competitive team the last 2 seasons, but you didn't have any like other than Temp. I love Donnie, but like that team just wasn't interesting enough to really care about even at the bottom of the table. I mean, like put Temp, put Censor, put Methods, and put Money Chain all on the same roster. Let there be content, and we can really get it popping here.
I mean, we've talked about censor before. It was notably I talked about uh, Seattle should have given him a minimum offer when they were going through their transition there from Looney to uh, Classic. But um, yeah, I mean that would certainly be an interesting one if it happened.
Could you imagine like the I don't know if the Legion are really interested in doing YouTube videos, but could you imagine if you say you put like Brezzy on your substitute as the substitute for the Paris Legion, and then you have Censor on your team, and then you make YouTube videos of Brezzy trying to teach Censor French, and then Censor is trying to teach Brezzy how to lift really heavy weights. Like, would that not be
Bro,
pristine content?
I mean, you already got that tweet from Paris. You might be like throwing out too many ideas here. You might want to like, slide in the DMs or something with that
Patent
stuff.
pending, Paris. Don't like. I know you guys don't file trademarks, but I will. So I will make sure that that you guys cannot steal any more of my ideas. But if you guys want to bring me on as like a CDL consultant, I would 100% be down with that. Like
Oh my God.
pay me $5,000 a year just to give you some ideas. I would be more than happy to oblige. I think that might do it. I think we
On that note,
yeah, on that note, Paris Legion, please hire me. I can be an assistant coach for Theory. Yeah, but that does it for the show. Oh no, what are you saying?
I was just gonna say one quick thing before you did your outro. CRONE did tweet earlier today. Just gonna read it off. He said, "Reminder that deals cannot be made until September 5th. These rosters aren't officially locked in and could still change." So that's just something I wanted to reiterate here at the end and make sure you guys keep in mind. Aside from those few moves that we mentioned at the beginning of the show, everything that we talked about towards the latter half here from CRONE's reports and his tweets, none of it is actually official. It's all reported moves until teams actually confirm or announce their lineups and stuff like that. So just wanted to throw that out there as a reminder and keep that in mind.
Yeah, never really believe what we are saying as fact.
That's not what I'm saying.
No, yeah, everything is just reported. Things are obviously pretty fluid right now. All these rosters, like I think the best or the most well-known example might have been Seattle going into the 2020 season. They were expecting their roster to include Envoy and Aristides and Octane. Like they probably would have had the best roster in the league had that gone through, but things changed at the last minute, and Aristides and Envoy ended up on Chicago, and Seattle ended up with one of the worst teams in the CDL. So things can change very quickly. But we do really thank CRONE for dropping a bunch of these bombs, giving us some content on this Friday evening. Yeah, so make sure to go to dotesports.com. CRONE is our bomb dropper in Call of Duty, but we have Jacob Wolf. He's dropping all kinds of wolf bombs all the time. We have Pablo, aka Bloop. So a lot of breaking news on dotesports.com and a lot of other great content to read on there as well. That was not an advertisement, but we will get pay raises if things work out well for Dot over the next few years. So yeah, thank you guys for listening/watching. Make sure to subscribe or follow us on whatever platform you're listening/watching on. We are on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, etc. Make sure to give us 5-star rating on Apple. Follow us on Twitter. He's at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Presbyers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. Don't know when the next show will be. It will kind of play it by ear as Roster Mania continues to heat up. If there's just not a lot of content, we're not going to just force an episode and twiddle our thumbs for half an hour, 45 minutes trying to put out an episode. But 2 episodes this week, so you're welcome. Yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Busy day, certainly, today in the virtual .esports office, but hopefully you guys enjoyed all the content. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode of the podcast. Like Preston said, we'll let you know on Twitter whenever the next episode is. And if you have any feedback for us on, obviously, these last couple episodes have been different than what we were doing most of the season before this, since there's not any actual games to cover and we're just talking about rosters and stuff. So if you guys have any feedback, feel free to let us know. We'll always appreciate that. But yeah, other than that, thanks for tuning in. And as always, remember to send the chow.